Hi, in this video I want to chat with you about the two approaches to story structure. Let's say you're writing a memoir or a testimony of your life. You're going to need a structure for your story, even though it's non-fiction or factual. Let's say you're writing a fantasy novel, which is of course fiction. You're still going to need some sort of structure in order to shape all the fragmented parts of your story into a meaningful whole. So how do you go about this? Well, I think that there are two basic ways in which people shape their story. And the first I'm going to call formulaic. I don't mean that in a negative sense at all. I just simply mean it in a literal sense, that authors choose to use a pre-existing formula or structure in order to bring order to their material. And the most common of these pre-existing formulas or structures is, of course, a three-act structure of storytelling. So what does that look like? It's very simple. It's Act 1, Exposition. That involves the setup of the story, especially the establishing of the lead character. It involves an inciting action or incident, that's to say something that begins to disturb the lead character's ordinary world, and it involves a first plot point, which is a kind of door of no return into a new reality or phase for the hero. Act 2 is about confrontation, in which in this new world, in this new stage of life, the hero experiences rising action and conflict. The hero will then face a moment of pause, as it were, which is called the midpoint, in which something is given or something happens that causes that hero to take a new direction. And then there's a second plot point, another door of no return through which that hero passes. So Act 2 is really confrontation, but Act 3 is resolution, and that involves a pre-climax phase, a climax event or stage, and then a final denouement. Now let's see how that applies to a book that many of you will know, the most, in my opinion, famous and finely written of all Christian memoirs, and that is Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, which describes her experiences in World War II. Act 1 of that book is Exposition. It involves the setup of the story. Corrie is the lead character. She's growing up in a family where her mother is dead, but her father is still alive, and she's growing up with 3 other siblings. She's particularly close to her sister Betsy. They're living in Harlem in the 1930s, and there's an inciting incident or action in the form of the Nazis coming to power in nearby Germany. And then the first plot point is when the Nazis invade her own country, Holland, and now their nation is occupied. This leads to Act 2, which is confrontation. There's rising action and increasing conflict as the ten Boom family, which is devoutly Christian and committed to helping those in need, decides to create a secret room in their house, a hiding place for Jewish people on the run. This involves them eventually getting found out and arrested, sent to prison, and then in Betsy and Corrie's case, transported to a death camp, Ravensbrück. That's the midpoint of Act 2. And then there's increasing difficulty for Betsy and Corrie in a lice-infested hut. Betsy becomes very ill, and in that phase she starts to think about what's going to happen after the war, and she tells Corrie that she's to share the message of God's love all over the world once the war is ended. And then Betsy dies. And after her death, something very curious and unexpected happens. Obviously, Corrie is massively traumatized by her sister's death. But there's also something very significant in that there's an administrative error, and Corrie is released from Ravensbrück on New Year's Day 1945. And now Act 3 begins, which is resolution. In Act 3, Corrie goes back to Holland and finds it incredibly hard to adjust. This is the pre-climax phase. But she remembers what Betsy has said to her in Ravensbrook. Go tell the world that there is no pit of suffering so deep that Jesus Christ is not deeper still. And Corrie decides that that's exactly what she's going to do. She's going to share that message, and in sharing that message, eventually she encounters a very wealthy woman. Now, Betsy had said that her vision was one day for there to be a house where people could come and get healed from the traumas of war. And Betsy's vision was also that that house should be green, and that its windows would be filled with pot plants or boxed plants and flowers. And so when Corrie meets this very rich woman, and the woman offers her house to become a centre of healing, she realizes this is the moment of the fulfillment of Betsy's post-war vision. And she says yes, she paints it green and she puts boxed flowers in the windows. And that's the climax, if you will, that leads then to the denouement, which is the further giving of a gift, that's to say, a camp. Now, Betsy had had a vision of a former concentration camp being turned into a place of relief and recovery for those who had been brutalized by their experiences in the war, and that's exactly what happens. And so the story ends with the denouement of Betsy's vision being fulfilled in full in Corrie's experience. So you can see there how a non-fictional memoir, very memorable, perhaps the most memorable one in the last 100 years of Christian writing and books, how that relies on a formula, that's to say the 3-act structure. And so you can use that with non-fiction. You can use that with your own story, your own autobiography or memoir, if it's a shorter slice of your life, not the whole of your life, which would be an autobiography as opposed to a memoir. But you can also use it for fiction. So if you're writing a fantasy story or a screenplay, you can use this 3-act approach too. But that's not the only approach. There's also a second approach that's commonly now used in this postmodern world, and that's the organic approach. I'm calling it organic because it's wholly different from the formulaic approach. If the formulaic approach is very pre-planned and premeditated, where each part of the story conforms to a stage in the 3-act structure, the organic approach is very different from that. So the author will very often not have a clear idea in her or his mind of how the story is going to progress at all. They start the story, and if their characters have what someone once called the actual density of the real, in other words, they are compellingly human and not caricatures, then they will start behaving in ways that are consistent with their character, but which are also surprising even to the author. And so in this organic model, things are allowed much more to grow and to flow. They're not conforming to a pre-existing structure. In this model, actually, the author's being a little bit more rebellious and allowing things to proceed in an empirical, in an episodic, and in a chronological way, which brings up many surprises even for the author. I think one of the best examples of this kind of organic storytelling in recent years is the 2017 film 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And that is a film that's directed and written by one of my favorite directors, Martin McDonagh. He's the director of In Bruges and 7 Psychopaths and that wonderful recent film, The Banshees of Inisherin. He's a very unusual and extremely original creative force in filmmaking. The story is about a woman called Mildred Hayes, who 7 months before the story begins lost her daughter. Her daughter was raped and murdered. The person who committed this atrocious crime has not been discovered. And the mother, Mildred, acted by the amazing Frances McDormand, is extremely frustrated by the lack of progress. She sees that there are 3 unused billboards outside her town, the fictional town of Ebbing, She finds the guy who owns them, a guy called Welby, and she rents them off him, and she puts 3 messages on those billboards, all of them directed at Chief Willoughby, the local chief of police, acted by Woody Harrelson, and they're all very critical about the lack of progress that he and his team have made in their investigation. And so a conflict now arises between Mildred, the mother, and Chief Willoughby, and the story begins to take on a life of its own. It begins to evolve. It begins to grow organically. It begins to flow and grow in ways that Martin McDonagh did not anticipate. And therefore it doesn't have this formulaic 3-act structure at all. It just kind of proceeds in one direction according to the way the characters are developing, and then proceeds in another direction, and it feels very episodic, and yet it is entirely riveting. You would expect a story that doesn't have the coherence of a 3-act structure to be hard to follow, but this one is absolutely compelling. Frances McDormand won an Oscar for her portrayal as the mother, and Sam Rockwell, who's one of the police officers, a racist police officer working under Chief Willoughby, he also won an Oscar. So you can see that this film has had an incredible amount of traction. Martin McDonagh himself won the Oscar for original screenplay. He wrote the story. And he said afterwards that he had no idea how this story was going to play out. For example, Chief Willoughby, plot spoiler coming up, Chief Willoughby, eventually we learn that he is dying of cancer. He has a memorable day with his wife and 2 daughters, having a picnic by a lake and just enjoying a wonderful time, a memorable time together, and then shoots himself, obviously alone at home in the privacy of his own room. But that was not expected. Martin McDonagh, the screenplay writer and the director, did not anticipate that happening. But when he came to that moment, he realized that was the right thing. That made sense because of the characterization of Chief Willoughby. And here's the thing, right at the end of the film, the last frames of the film portray Mildred and Dixon going off in a car on a sort of road trip, a revenge trip. And Dixon has a shotgun on his lap, and Mildred says, "You're going to shoot him," referring to the person they're pursuing, their quarry. And he says, "I'm really not sure." And she just says, "Well, we'll decide on the way." I think that phrase, "we'll decide on the way," is immensely significant. I think it's a summary, a signature, if you will, of Martin McDonagh's process as a writer. We'll decide on the way. That, my friends, is organic, structural storytelling. So there are your 2 main approaches. You can be formulaic, you can be more organic, or you can be a combination of the 2, because these 2 things are not separated poles. They're more like a Venn diagram where the 2 things overlap. So in my novel, for example, A Book in Time, I had an idea of the beginning and the ending, and that was, I suppose, premeditated and slightly formulaic. But everything in between, the 10 chapters or stages or parts of the novel in between, I didn't really know what was going to happen. It was entirely dependent on how the main character, who's a book in time, evolved over those 200 years. So you can do both. You can be formulaic and organic. So when I say there are 2 approaches, there are, broadly speaking, 2 approaches, but you can creatively fuse elements of the 2 if you want to. I hope this has been helpful. If it has, please hit the subscribe button and the like button if you've enjoyed it. Do share it with other people. We do really appreciate it when you do. And in the meantime, I hope that you are able to live luminously and write radiantly. We can all write in the light with the correct structure that befits the story that we want to tell.